Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe and leave a like. It means everything to us. Please share this video with someone you care about and switch on post notifications so you won't miss any future videos. Thank you for always supporting. Now, relax and let's begin. Laura Benson had the kind of marriage people praised in soft, admiring tones. Neighbors spoke of how peaceful she and Anthony seemed together, how they returned from church side by side, how she adjusted his collar before they entered gatherings, how he always opened the car door for her in public. Their home was modest but warm, filled with scented candles, framed wedding photographs, and the quiet rhythm of two people who once believed love alone could survive anything. Laura loved Anthony deeply. She knew his moods, his silences, his favorite meals, the way stress sat between his brows after work, and she carried him gently. Anthony loved Laura too, though not always bravely. He worked long hours, paid the bills faithfully, and often brought home little surprises. Roasted corn she liked, fabric for new dresses, or pastries from the bakery near his office. To outsiders, they looked like a strong couple growing steadily into their future. But beneath that appearance, a quiet ache had begun to spread through their marriage. 3 years had passed without a child. Questions came wrapped in fake concern. Smiles lingered too long. Laura felt the pressure first, like a whisper in crowded rooms. Anthony heard it too, but where she felt pain, he felt discomfort and avoided it. The first wound came during a Sunday visit to Anthony's mother's house. Carol Benson served jollof rice and fried plantain with a smile that looked generous until she opened her mouth. A house is never truly complete until a baby is crying inside it, she said lightly, scooping stew onto Anthony's plate. Donna laughed, leaning back in her chair. That is true, Mommy. Some homes are too quiet these days. The words were casual enough to pass as harmless, but Laura felt them land in her chest like stones. She lowered her gaze to her food, forcing herself to smile while her appetite slowly disappeared. Anthony heard everything. Laura kept waiting for him to say, "Please stop," or even, "Mom, that's enough." Instead, he smiled tightly and reached for water. The rest of the meal continued with shallow conversation, but Laura could hardly hear anything above the humiliation pounding in her ears. That night, when they returned home, she removed her earrings slowly and asked, "Why didn't you say anything?" Anthony loosened his tie and sighed. "Laura, you know how my mother is. Don't take everything personally." She looked at him, wounded. "So I should just keep swallowing insults because your family enjoys giving them?" He said nothing useful, and the silence hurt more. After that visit, Laura did not become bitter. She became quieter. She still woke before Anthony to prepare breakfast, still ironed his shirts carefully, still asked how his meetings went when he returned home. But something inside her had grown cautious. Her laughter no longer came as easily. When Anthony joked, she smiled, yet the light in it was weaker. She began crying in the bathroom sometimes, letting the shower drown her sobs. She hated that she was becoming a woman who measured ordinary family visits like emotional battlefields. Still, she kept hoping Anthony would notice the depth of her pain and protect her before resentment built into something irreversible. That same week, Carol invited them for another lunch. Laura did not want to go. "Please, Anthony, let's stay home just this once," she said gently while folding laundry. But Anthony touched her shoulder and replied, "It will be fine. Maybe last time was nothing." You know how families talk. Laura agreed because she loved peace and because refusing would create another issue. At lunch, Carol told a story about a woman who had the wisdom to release a husband she could not give children. Donna added, "At least she knew when she had become a burden." Anthony cleared his throat and muttered, "Mom, please." But it was too soft, too late, too weak. The silence in their home changed shape after that. It was no longer peaceful silence, the kind shared by couples who understand each other deeply. It became a careful silence shaped by unsaid pain. Laura stopped bringing up his family often because every conversation about them ended in frustration, excuses, or gentle dismissals that made her feel foolish for speaking at all. Anthony, on his part, sensed the heaviness but preferred routine over confrontation. They still lay on the same bed, but sometimes it felt as if whole oceans stretched between their two sides. He would fall asleep quickly. Laura would stare at the ceiling, wondering why love could feel so lonely. One evening, she gathered the courage to ask the question that had haunted her. Anthony, do you believe I'm the problem? He looked up from his phone, startled. What kind of question is that? Laura swallowed hard. Your mother and sister speak as if I ruined your life. Sometimes you act like you don't know whether to defend me or agree with them. Anthony exhaled slowly. I don't think that, Laura. We just need patience. Let's keep praying. These things take time. She nodded, but the answer broke her in a different way. He had not denied her pain. He had only postponed it. She realized prayer was becoming his way of avoiding courage. Donna crossed the line on a hot Thursday afternoon when she came to their house uninvited. Laura had just returned from a clinic consultation and was arranging the medicines on the dining table when Donna strolled in, sunglasses still on, perfume filling the room. She glanced at the prescription paper and burst into mocking laughter. Still chasing solutions? She said. My dear, some women are meant to decorate homes, not build legacies. Laura stared at her, stunned. Donna, please, mind your words, she said quietly. Donna only shrugged and sat down. I'm helping you face reality. Not every woman is meant to become a mother. Some should know when to step aside. Anthony entered halfway through the exchange. He sensed tension immediately, but instead of demanding that Donna leave, he asked stiffly, what's going on here? Laura turned to him, with hurt burning in her eyes. Donna answered first. Nothing serious. We were just talking. Laura expected Anthony to look at the medicine, the tears in her eyes, the cruelty hanging in the room, and understand. Instead, he changed the subject and asked Donna if she wanted juice. After she left, Laura broke down. Why? She cried. Why can't they say anything to me in my own home? Anthony rubbed his forehead. Can we not start this again? That answer wounded her more than Donna's insult. Donald Benson arrived one Saturday evening with roasted fish and a bottle of malt, saying he had been passing by and thought to check in. He was Anthony's older cousin, broad-shouldered, thoughtful, and less easily swept away by family politics than the others. He noticed things quickly. He noticed Laura's tired smile, the way she answered carefully before glancing at Anthony, the quiet tension that hovered in simple conversations. During dinner, he watched Anthony dismiss one of Laura's gentle observations without malice, but also without attention. Donald said little then, but by the time they sat outside with plastic chairs under the fading evening sky, he had already seen enough to worry him. When Laura went inside to clear plates, Donald leaned toward Anthony and spoke in a low voice. Your wife is not all right. Anthony frowned. What do you mean? Donald sighed. I mean, she looks like someone trying not to break in her own house. Silence can destroy a home faster than shouting. Anthony forced a laugh. You're reading too much into things. Laura is just emotional lately. My family talks, yes, but they will calm down. Donald shook his head. Be careful, Anthony. Women do not stop smiling like that for no reason. Anthony dismissed him, but Donald's warning stayed in the air long after he left. The fainting happened on a Monday afternoon at a crowded supermarket. Laura had been standing near the fruit section, holding a basket with detergent, tomatoes, and a loaf of bread. When the room tilted around her, she remembered hearing a woman ask, Madam, are you okay? Before everything went black. When she opened her eyes again, the ceiling above her was white and unfamiliar, and the smell of antiseptic clung to the air. She was lying in a small private clinic a few streets away. Her head pounded. Her throat felt dry. Panic rose immediately. My husband, she whispered. Please call my husband. A nurse nodded and assured her they already had. Carol somehow arrived before Anthony. She swept into the clinic as if she owned the place, her expression arranged into concern. Laura, what happened? She asked, holding Laura's hand briefly. But there was something cold in her eyes that made Laura uneasy. The nurse mentioned they were running tests because the fainting might be related to stress or hormones. Carol's face changed just a little. When Anthony finally arrived, breathless and worried, Laura reached for him instinctively. He held her hand, but his mind already seemed elsewhere, distracted by fear and confusion. Laura wanted tenderness. What she got was anxious silence, and even on that hospital bed, she felt alone. While Laura rested, and Anthony paced the corridor, Carol made her move. She had overheard enough from the nurse to suspect pregnancy might be possible, and that possibility terrified her more than anything. A baby would strengthen Laura's place in the family forever. She found the clinic nurse, a wary young woman named Stella, crying quietly near the back entrance over unpaid bills and a sick child at home. Carol spoke softly, like a woman offering mercy instead of destruction. "I can help you," she said, slipping an envelope from her handbag. "But I need you to help me too." Stella stared at the money, shame and desperation colliding inside her. "What do you want me to do?" Stella asked in a trembling voice. Carol lowered her tone. "Adjust the report, nothing dramatic, just enough to say Laura has serious reproductive complications. Let her believe pregnancy is nearly impossible." Stella recoiled. "Madame, that is dangerous." Carol's smile hardened. "Poverty is dangerous too." Minutes later, the envelope changed hands. Laura lay in the ward, unaware that her future was being rewritten in whispers. Outside, Anthony rubbed his face and muttered, "God, please don't let this be bad." He had no idea that the worst threat to his marriage was not any medical result, but the mother whose influence he had never truly challenged. When the doctor returned with the report, his tone was careful, but the damage was immediate. "Mrs. Benson," he said, "the results are concerning. There may be severe complications affecting your reproductive health." Laura stared at him, her mouth parting but no sound coming out. The room seemed to shrink around her. Anthony sat beside her, rigid and pale. She turned toward him, hoping for comfort, for his arms, for some urgent denial of the cruelty of life. But he only lowered his head and went quiet. Carol stood slightly behind them, wearing a sad expression so convincing it might have deceived anyone who did not know where the evil began. The drive home felt endless. Rain tapped against the windscreen as Laura stared out of the passenger window, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. At last she whispered, "Anthony, what if I can never give you a child?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Let's not think the worst yet," he muttered. "We'll see." His words were not cruel, but they were empty. And emptiness can wound more deeply than harshness. That night, Laura lay awake beside him, with one hand over her stomach, grieving a future she thought had died. She realized with fresh horror that even in her most devastating moments, she did not feel held. After the clinic report, the atmosphere in the Benson family changed from subtle pressure to open contempt. Carol no longer bothered hiding her disappointment. Donna began making pointed remarks every time she visited, referring to Laura as though she were a failed investment. "Anthony deserves peace," she said one afternoon, while scrolling through her phone. "A man shouldn't suffer forever because of one mistake." Laura understood exactly who the mistake was. Anthony noticed the cruelty worsening, yet instead of confronting it directly, he simply reduced visits or changed conversations. To him, that felt like trying. To Laura, it felt like surrender. His silence was becoming permission, and everyone around them seemed to know it. Anthony himself changed too. He still provided, still came home every night, still asked whether Laura had eaten. But an invisible wall began rising between them. He was disappointed, confused, and ashamed of those feelings, so he buried them under tiredness and distance. Laura tried to remain warm. She served his meals, asked about work, folded his clothes neatly, but she could sense the shame he was not saying aloud. The false diagnosis had not only bruised her hope, it had wounded her dignity. Sometimes, when Anthony looked at her too long, Laura imagined he was silently measuring the future he thought she could no longer give him. That thought broke her repeatedly. A few weeks later, Laura began noticing strange changes in her body. She woke up with a bitter taste in her mouth. The smell of frying eggs made her nauseous. She felt exhausted even after long sleep, and sometimes her emotions rose so suddenly she had to lock herself in the bathroom to steady her breathing. A tiny thought began to form. What if the clinic had been wrong? But the fear of hope was stronger than the hope itself. She had already mourned too much. She could not bear another disappointment. So instead of telling anyone, Laura slipped into a pharmacy one afternoon and bought a pregnancy test, hiding it beneath groceries. For 3 days, the test remained inside her wardrobe drawer, untouched. Every time Laura looked at it, her chest tightened. She wanted to know, but she was terrified that seeing one line would finally crush the stubborn little hope still living inside her. Meanwhile, Anthony grew more restless at home. He snapped over little things, apologized later, then withdrew again. Family pressure and private guilt were making him irritable, though he would never admit it plainly. Their once gentle home felt tense, like a place where words had become dangerous. At night, Laura would rest her palm over her lower stomach and whisper, "Please, don't let me be imagining this." Carol announced a larger family dinner and made it sound like a command wrapped in politeness. Laura pleaded softly with Anthony that evening. "Please, I don't want to go. I'm tired." Anthony looked troubled, but replied, "If we don't go, it will become another issue. Let's just endure tonight and leave early." Laura agreed. Because she was too worn down to argue at the dinner, laughter filled the room, but it was the kind of laughter that made her feel unsafe. Plates clinked, glasses touched. Then Donna, smiling wickedly, said, "If Anthony had married a stronger woman, maybe by now he'd be carrying his son around the compound." A heavy silence followed, but it was not the kind that protects. It was the kind that watches. Laura slowly turned her face toward Anthony. Her eyes were already wet, silently begging him to speak, to defend her once, clearly, without fear. Anthony shifted in his chair, glanced at his mother, then looked down at his plate. He said nothing, not one sentence, not even a weak protest. Something inside Laura gave way completely in that moment. She finished the night like a ghost. Back home, she removed her gele, sat on the edge of the bed, and wept until dawn. Anthony reached toward her once, then withdrew his hand when she flinched. At first light, Laura rose quietly and began packing. She did not move with anger, but with aching finality. She folded her dresses with trembling fingers, wrapped her wedding album in a scarf, and paused over small household things that carried memories. The mug Anthony liked, the cushion they bought together, the curtains she had hemmed by hand. She was not living because she had stopped loving him. She was living because love had become a place where she could no longer breathe. When Anthony woke and saw the bags by the door, he sat up sharply. "Laura, what is this?" he asked, voice rough with sleep and disbelief. Laura turned slowly. Her face was swollen from crying, but her voice was calm. "I cannot keep dying in a house where people destroy me and my husband watches." Anthony got out of bed, annoyed more than alarmed. "Don't be dramatic. You just need time to cool down." She shook her head. "You still don't understand." He tried to touch her arm, but she stepped back. "Laura, where will you even go?" She looked at him with a sadness colder than anger. "Somewhere I won't have to beg to be defended." Anthony believed she would return within days. He did not realize he was watching the beginning of the end. Laura went to George Cole because he was the only place that still felt safe in memory. George had been one of her late father's closest friends, a widower with a measured voice, thoughtful eyes, and the old-fashioned dignity of a man who knew how to protect without intruding. When he opened the door and saw her standing there with 2 suitcases and swollen eyes, his face softened immediately. "Laura," he said gently, stepping aside. "Come in, my child." He did not bombard her with questions. He carried one bag himself, showed her to a quiet room, and told the housekeeper to prepare tea. That kindness nearly undid her completely. For the first time in months, Laura sat in a room where nobody measured her worth by childbirth, obedience, or silence. George waited until she was ready to speak, and when she finally told him pieces of the story, he listened without interruption. "You do not have to decide everything today," he said when she finished. "Rest first. Broken hearts make frightened decisions." Laura nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I feel ashamed," she confessed. George leaned back and answered firmly, "The shame is not yours." His home was quiet, respectful, and free of hidden mockery. Every small gentleness there felt unfamiliar enough to be painful. Back at home, Anthony convinced himself Laura's departure was temporary. He told Carol she just needs a few days, and Carol replied with a dismissive wave. "Women do this all the time. She'll come back when she gets tired of drama." Anthony clung to those words because the alternative was unbearable. He imagined Laura crying at a friend's house, waiting for him to call with enough tenderness to persuade her home. So he sent short messages. "Are you okay? Come back and let's talk. Don't let outsiders get into your head." When she did not respond, he grew irritated, then anxious, then defensive, though he still refused to call his family's cruelty by its proper name. But as days turned into weeks, the reality of her absence spread through the house like dust. Her side of the wardrobe stood empty. Her scarf was no longer hanging behind the bedroom door. No scent of stew simmered in the kitchen when he returned from work. No warm voice asked, "Have you eaten?" Anthony began noticing how much Laura had quietly filled his life. He missed the way she remembered his deadlines, the way she folded his handkerchiefs, the peace that seemed to settle around him when she was near. Still, he was not yet brave enough to say the words that mattered most. "I failed you. I should have protected you." George watched Laura carefully over the next several days. He noticed how she held her body when walking, how certain smells disturbed her, how fatigue seemed to hang over her like a soft shadow. One afternoon, he said gently, "Laura, I think we should repeat those tests with a better doctor." She froze. "I can't go through that again." George's voice remained calm. "Then go through it once more with truth." After much hesitation, she agreed. The new clinic was cleaner, quieter, more professional. The doctor reviewed the previous report with a furrowed brow and ordered fresh tests. Laura sat in the consulting room, gripping her handbag until her knuckles turned pale. When the doctor finally smiled and said, "Mrs. Benson, you are pregnant." Laura did not respond immediately. She simply stared, as if language had abandoned her. Then tears rushed down her face. They were not ordinary tears of joy. They carried shock, grief, relief, and rage all at once. "Pregnant?" she whispered. "Are you sure?" The doctor nodded kindly. "Very sure. You are already well into early pregnancy." Laura bent forward, sobbing into her palms. George sat beside her, deeply moved. She had spent weeks grieving a future that had actually been growing inside her body. George placed a steady hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "Then somebody lied to you." The days after the second test were emotionally confusing for Laura. In private moments, she would smile through tears, resting both hands over her stomach and whispering to the little life inside her. But joy never came alone. It arrived, carrying grief on its back. She kept imagining how this news should have been received. Anthony lifting her in relief, their home filling with laughter, their pain transformed into gratitude. Instead, she sat in a quiet guest room in another man's house, mourning the tenderness that should have surrounded the miracle. Sometimes she would laugh one minute and cry the next. Pregnancy was real. So was the heartbreak wrapped tightly around it. George encouraged steadiness. "Do not let emotion rush you into decisions," he told her during evening tea. "This child changes many things, but it does not erase what happened to you." Laura nodded. She still loved Anthony, and that truth made everything harder. Yet, she also knew that bringing a child into a marriage without safety would only create new suffering. "Should I tell him?" she asked one night. George was quiet for a moment. "Tell him when truth can protect you, not when your tenderness can be used against you." Laura accepted that wisdom. For once, she wanted clarity before chaos, evidence before pleading, and dignity before reconciliation. Donald returned to Anthony's house after hearing from a relative that Laura still had not come back. He found Anthony sitting alone in the living room, tie loosened, television on but unwatched. "So this is how you want your home to end?" Donald asked bluntly. Anthony frowned. "I've called her. She doesn't answer. What more do you want me to do?" Donald sat across from him, his gaze unwavering. "Start with honesty. A woman does not live quietly like that unless something inside her has been dying for a long time." Anthony looked away. "You're making it sound worse than it is." Donald shook his head. "No, you've been making it sound smaller than it is." After Donald left, Anthony could not settle. He began replaying memories he had once brushed aside. Laura's trembling silence after family gatherings, the way she would force a smile when Carol visited, the softness in her voice every time she asked him to speak up. Regret crept in, but still mixed with pride. He missed her fiercely now, yet he did not fully understand the scale of the damage. In his mind, the marriage was bruised, not broken. He still believed apologies and time might repair everything. What he did not know was that Laura's pain had already crossed into a place where love could remain, but trust could die. George was a lawyer by training and an observant man by nature. The new medical report had settled one thing, but it had also raised a terrible question. How could the first clinic have been so wrong? He began making discreet inquiries, contacting someone he knew at the medical records office, speaking carefully to administrative staff, and requesting copies of documents. Small irregularities emerged. Dates did not align. Certain notations looked inserted after the fact. A payment had been made to a nurse's account 2 days after Laura's clinic visit. George's suspicion hardened into alarm. This was no careless error. Something about Laura's first diagnosis had the scent of deliberate manipulation. He did not tell Laura everything yet. She was carrying enough emotion already, and he wanted facts before reopening fresh wounds. Still, he watched her with a new protectiveness. As she sat on the veranda some evenings, one hand on her belly, George would think about how close she had come to believing she was permanently broken. The cruelty of that lie made him quietly furious. One afternoon, he murmured to himself, "If someone did this, they will answer for it." Laura noticed his distant expression and asked, "Is something wrong?" George gave her a reassuring smile. "Not wrong," he said carefully, "but some truths are beginning to move." Anthony learned that Laura was staying with George Cole through a cousin who mentioned it casually over the phone. The name hit him strangely. George was older, respected, and known for integrity. But pain is rarely reasonable. Anthony's mind twisted the information before his better judgment could steady it. "George Cole," he repeated. "Why would she be there?" When Carol overheard, she wasted no time fueling the poison. "A woman who lives boldly often has confidence from somewhere," she said, pretending to arrange flowers. "Nobody walks away that calmly without backup." Anthony's chest tightened. His pride, fear, and insecurity began mixing into suspicions he could barely control. From then on, Anthony's calls to Laura carried a new edge. "So, you're staying with George now?" he asked one evening when she finally picked up. Laura's voice was tired and distant. "Yes." He laughed bitterly. "That explains your confidence." There was a pause, then she replied softly, "It explains my safety." The line went dead. Anthony stood in the dark holding his phone, anger flaring because fear was easier to bear when disguised as accusation. Yet, underneath it all was a painful realization. Laura was not moving like a woman waiting to be begged home. She was moving like someone slowly building a life that might no longer have room for him. Laura did not decide on divorce in a single dramatic moment. The decision formed slowly, like rain gathering before a storm. She spent weeks reflecting, praying, writing in a small notebook, and measuring the truth without sentimentality. She still loved Anthony. That was the hardest part. If she had hated him, living would have felt cleaner. But love remained bruised and loyal, even while trust lay broken. One evening, seated across from George in his study, Laura said in a trembling but steady voice, "I want to file." George looked at her carefully. "Are you certain?" She nodded. "I cannot raise a child in a marriage where silence protects cruelty." When Anthony was served the divorce papers, the ground seemed to vanish beneath him. "No," he muttered, reading the document twice, then 3 times. "She can't be serious." He called immediately, then called again when she didn't answer, then began sending messages that swung wildly between pleading and anger. "Laura, don't do this. Let's meet. Why are you listening to outsiders? How can you throw away our marriage like this?" But Laura's pain had matured into clarity. She replied only once, "I did not throw it away. I carried it alone until I could no longer breathe." Anthony stared at the message and felt, for the first time, real panic. By the 4th month, Laura's body began revealing what she had been quietly carrying. Her waist softened. The curve of her stomach became more noticeable beneath fitted dresses. Even her face changed, touched by that fragile, unmistakable glow pregnancy sometimes brings. George remained respectful and careful, accompanying her to hospital appointments, waiting outside consultation rooms, and carrying files without ever behaving in a way that crossed boundaries. But other people saw them together and formed assumptions easily. Laura felt the weight of those assumptions every time a receptionist smiled knowingly or an older woman at the clinic asked, "Is this your husband?" George would simply answer, I am family. Laura struggled with the symbolism of it all. Soon, Anthony would see her visibly pregnant while she stood beside another man in legal proceedings meant to end their marriage. The image would look exactly like betrayal, but then she would remember every time she had protected Anthony's image while her own heart bled in silence. She was tired of carrying his comfort on top of her suffering. One evening, while folding baby's scan, reports into a file, she whispered to her unborn child, "I wish this was gentler. I wish your father had fought for us sooner." Her eyes filled with tears, but for the first time, she did not feel guilty for choosing herself. George eventually found Stella, the nurse from the first clinic, through careful persistence. At first, she refused to talk. She insisted the report had been a medical judgment and that George should stop disturbing her peace. But guilt is a heavy thing, and fear can crack even the most stubborn denial. When George placed bank transfer records on the table and calmly mentioned legal consequences for medical fraud, Stella's face drained of color. Her hands shook. "I didn't want to do it," she whispered. "I needed the money. My son was sick." George's voice remained stern but not cruel. "Need does not erase what you did to that woman." Once Stella began speaking, the confession came in broken pieces. Carol had approached her privately, offered money, and insisted Laura needed to believe pregnancy was nearly impossible. Donna had known enough to encourage the narrative later. George recorded the confession legally and collected supporting evidence. When he told Laura the truth in measured detail, she did not scream. She sat completely still, her hand pressed over her mouth, tears pouring soundlessly. Carol had not only insulted her publicly, she had tampered with the most intimate truth of her life. "She took my joy before I even knew I had it," Laura whispered. George nodded sadly. "And she will answer for it." Donald noticed the shift in Carol before Anthony did. She had become strangely defensive, asking odd questions about lawyers and dates, speaking too quickly whenever Laura's name came up. One evening, Donald pulled Anthony aside after a family gathering and said quietly, "Your mother is afraid." Anthony frowned. "Afraid of what?" Donald looked him in the eye. "That the truth may be catching up." The words unsettled Anthony deeply. Old details began resurfacing in his mind. How Carol had reached the clinic before he did. How strongly she discouraged second opinions. How quickly she started speaking of Laura like a hopeless case. For the first time, suspicion pierced the armor of family loyalty. He tried questioning Carol gently the next day. "Mom, did anything unusual happen at that clinic?" Her reaction was immediate and theatrical. "What kind of question is that? So now I am the enemy because your wife ran away." Anthony flinched at the intensity of her defense. Donna joined in, scoffing. "Laura has filled your head with nonsense already." But instead of calming him, their anger deepened his fear. Something did not fit anymore. Anthony spent that night sitting alone in darkness, replaying memories with sickening clarity. The possibility he had protected the wrong people all along felt unbearable. Yet, beneath the horror was an even worse truth. Laura had begged him to see this years earlier. The night before the divorce hearing was sleepless for everyone. Laura sat on the edge of her bed in George's house, the lamp casting soft shadows across the room. One hand rested over her swollen stomach while the other held an old photograph from her wedding day. Anthony had been smiling in it, eyes full of warmth and promise. She traced the image with shaking fingers. "What happened to us?" she whispered. She still loved the man in the photograph, and that made tomorrow feel even crueler. Her child shifted lightly inside her, and Laura closed her eyes. "I will protect you," she murmured, though her own heart still felt terribly unprotected. Across town, Anthony sat on the living room floor with old messages open on his phone. He read her past texts, one after another, reminders to eat lunch, encouragement before meetings, prayers before difficult work presentations. How had such tenderness ended in court? He wanted to believe tomorrow would somehow repair things. Meanwhile, George reviewed the case documents in his study. Laura entered quietly and asked, "Am I doing the right thing?" He closed the file and answered carefully, "Only you can decide what peace costs. But peace built on silence is not peace at all." Those words stayed with her through the long night until dawn finally came. The courthouse was already crowded when Anthony arrived. Lawyers moved briskly through the corridor. Families whispered in clusters. and the heavy morning air carried the scent of dust and tension. Anthony wore a dark suit and looked composed from a distance, but inside he was unraveling. He expected anger from Laura, perhaps tears, perhaps one final emotional confrontation. Instead, he stood near the entrance trying to steady his breathing. When a car pulled up, the back door opened slowly. Laura stepped out, elegant in a soft dress that draped around her body. Then Anthony saw it, the unmistakable curve of a 5-month pregnant belly supported by one careful hand. For one suspended second, everything around him disappeared. George stepped out after her, carrying documents, moving protectively at her side. The sight struck Anthony with humiliating force. Pregnancy, another man, divorce, public shame. His chest tightened so badly he nearly stumbled. Laura looked tired but dignified, and George's presence beside her made the image even worse. In Anthony's mind, betrayal arranged itself instantly into certainty. Relatives nearby began murmuring. His pride fled with pain. He had imagined losing Laura slowly. He had not imagined watching her arrive at court visibly pregnant, leaning on another man, while the whole world stood around to witness his humiliation. Anthony moved toward them before reason could restrain him. "Laura!" he called, his voice shaking with outrage and disbelief. She turned slowly, one hand still under her stomach, her face calm in a way that unsettled him more than tears would have. George stepped slightly forward, protective but controlled. Anthony's eyes burned. "What is this?" he demanded. "What exactly am I looking at?" Laura said nothing at first. She only studied him, and that silence enraged him further. "You left my house, filed for divorce, and now you arrive pregnant beside another man. Is this the respect you had for our marriage?" People around them slowed, sensing drama before proceedings had even begun. Laura's expression did not crack. The woman who once cried at every hurt now stood with a grief older and colder than panic. Anthony kept speaking, his voice rising. "You could have at least waited. You could have had some shame," George said firmly. "Mr. Benson, lower your voice." But Anthony barely heard him. Then Laura spoke, and her words cut through the corridor like a blade. "This is what happens when a woman stops dying where she is not loved." Anthony fell silent, stunned. The sentence did not answer his accusation, yet it struck somewhere deeper than any explanation could. He felt anger first, then confusion, then something far worse, fear. Inside the courtroom, the truth began unfolding with painful precision. George presented the corrected medical reports first, then the timeline from Laura's second clinic, then the gestational dating that matched the period before she left Anthony's house. The lawyer's voice was measured, clinical, devastating. "The pregnancy was established during the marriage," he said. "The child Mrs. Benson is carrying is biologically Mr. Anthony Benson's." For a moment, Anthony did not move. He simply stared at the documents as if they belonged to another life. Then his gaze drifted helplessly to Laura's stomach. The child he had mistaken for proof of betrayal was his own. The courtroom air felt suddenly too thin. His anger collapsed into stunned heartbreak. Tears rushed into Anthony's eyes before pride could stop them. He looked at Laura with an expression she had once prayed to see: shocked tenderness, grief, love, and regret all colliding together. "My child," he whispered hoarsely. Laura's face tightened, but she nodded once. The sight of him breaking should have comforted her. Instead, it only made the tragedy sharper. He was discovering fatherhood at the same table where their marriage was being buried. Yet, even that was not the worst truth waiting in the room. George lifted another file and said, "There is more the court must hear regarding the false diagnosis." The second revelation was even crueler. George submitted Stella's confession, the transfer records, and supporting statements linking Carol to the altered clinic report. The courtroom grew unnaturally quiet as the truth settled. Carol had deliberately paid for Laura's medical results to be falsified, ensuring that hope would die before it could strengthen the marriage. Donna's mockery had deepened the wound, but Carol had created it. Anthony looked toward his mother with horror so raw it almost emptied his face of color. Carol could not even maintain her performance now. "I was trying to save you," she muttered weakly. Anthony stepped back as if her words themselves were poison. Laura then spoke with a trembling steadiness that silenced everyone. She did not scream. She did not perform pain. She simply told the truth. She spoke of nights spent crying alone, of family dinners where insults landed while her husband stared at his plate, of hospital fear answered with silence, of the cruel loneliness of carrying life while being told she was broken. Anthony wept openly now, stripped of all pride. "Laura, please," he whispered, voice breaking. She cried too, because part of her still loved him. Then she gave him the sentence that would remain with him forever. "You did not lose me when I got pregnant. You lost me every time you watched them wound me and said nothing." The divorce was granted that afternoon. The judge's decision was clear. Anthony had rights to participate in the child's life, but the marriage itself would not be restored by revelation or regret. Laura sat quietly through the final words, one hand resting over her stomach, tears slipping down her face with dignified restraint. She was not celebrating. This was not triumph in the joyful sense. It was survival with a wound. George remained beside her until everything ended, then stepped back respectfully, his role fulfilled. Donald approached later with bowed head and asked softly, "Can you ever forgive any of us?" Laura answered truthfully, "Forgiveness may come. Trust is gone." Outside the courthouse, Anthony stood alone for a long time after everyone began leaving. He watched Laura walk carefully toward the car, carrying his child and a life that no longer included him as husband. That was his real punishment. She had never belonged to another man. She was still his wife when she conceived the baby. The family he dreamed of had not been stolen from him by scandal or infidelity. He had surrendered it piece by piece through cowardice, silence, and misplaced loyalty. Laura moved forward, wounded but dignified, determined to protect her child with the strength heartbreak had taught her. Anthony remained behind, grieving the life he failed to defend. We've come to the end of the story. Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, share, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification. Thank you so much for watching.